Good morning, everybody. Let me please ask you to welcome our panelists here on stage. Take a seat. Thank you. So compute to compete, what are we talking about? How does computing capability translate to economic, security, or political power? From an economic standpoint, first, it's a foundation for innovation, right? If we're trying to solve problems like novel drug discovery, building efficient new turbofans, these hinge on access to compute capacity and cutting-edge computing capability. Computing is what enables research and development in many other domains, perhaps best highlighted by the current peak of generative AI. Second, security. Information, the access to it, the analysis of it has been a core part of warfare since time immemorial. Since the advent of the digital computer, it's been used to calculate everything from artillery trajectories to try and break cryptographic technologies. Computing has influenced military outcomes. And it's now, today, with the rise of increasingly distributed and autonomous operations, poised to play a pivotal role in the conduct of military operations around the world. Politically speaking, the reason for this formulation, actually, compute to compete, computing is not just a general discussion of technology. We're not here to just kind of work through cybersecurity implications. Computing relies on physical hardware. It poses unique political challenges. It has to live somewhere. So unlike the ephemerality of software, the mutability of data, compute is physical infrastructure. That means it's most readily subject to the laws of nations and the geopolitical limits of interstate competition. Computing is, more than perhaps any other element of cyberspace, save people, subject to political realities and constraints. So this discussion, I think we hope today, is going to offer some ideas on how computing plays a role in international security and competition, outside of narrow technical, market, or regulatory dynamics. To run this discussion, I am delighted to be joined by our four panelists here. So to introduce quickly from right to left, Julia Carver is a PhD candidate, DPhil candidate in international relations at the University of Oxford. She's also a European Cybersecurity Fellow at the European Cyber Conflict Research Initiative, an organization you're going to hear more about here in a minute. She also holds a political lectureship in the Magdalen College at Oxford, and in 2021 founded Oxford's Changing Character of War Center's Cyber Strategy and Technology Statecraft Working Group, which remains in operation to this day. To her right is Dr. Max Smeets, co-director of said European Cyber Conflict Research Initiative, as well as the European Cyber Conflict Research Incubator and the newly launched publication Binding Hook. Max is a senior researcher for the Center for Security Studies at ETH Zurich and author of the book, which you should all run out and buy if you haven't before, No Shortcuts: Why States Struggle to Develop a Military Cyber Force, alongside a wealth of other edited volumes and publications. To Max's right, Ms. Emma Schroeder, Associate Director of the Cyber Statecraft Initiative, part of the Atlantic Council of Technology Programs, where she focuses on developing statecraft and strategy for cyberspace that is useful for both policymakers and practitioners, with a particular focus, as we're going to get into today, on cybersecurity as it shapes and is shaped by kinetic conflict, including in Ukraine and Myanmar. And finally, at the end, Mr. Taylor Roberts, Director of Global Security Policy at Intel Corporation, a small American technology company, where he leads on cybersecurity policy engagements. Prior to Intel, Taylor served as cybersecurity advisor for the Office of Management and Budget in the U.S. government and at the University of Oxford as a senior researcher. So, for the assembled group today, I want to start our discussion off with a sort of broad question. In your minds, one which maybe perhaps go down the line, what characterizes the current state of competition for compute? And I wonder if you could call out a key trend or feature of this competition for us. So, Julia, starting with you.
Sure, thank you. So for me, I would say that you can think about the competition of compute through a variety of different lenses. I will be addressing this from more of an international relations perspective, such from my background. And while a large area of discussion has focused on semiconductor supply chains, there's two other stages of the compute supply chain that I would like to flag today and discuss further. And one of that areas for me is how digital infrastructure feeds into compute provision, which is the input into compute usage, which is another large area of discussion around artificial intelligence and the training of deep learning models. So this competition surrounding compute provision is also a key part of the story here, and that relies upon undersea cables, Especially with cloud computing, the demand for undersea cables has only risen. And one of the main trends, if you track the development of undersea cables, is that they overlap with key areas of geostrategic competition and sort of large pressure points, including the Indo-Pacific. We're very familiar with Taiwan and Taiwan's role in sort of compute power, but there's also other factors going on in that region, including the construction of undersea cables, which are an important part of the story. And related to that is the importance of digital and cyber capacity that is partially enabled by digital infrastructure developments and one's access and control over digital infrastructure more broadly. So that's sort of a broad area that I see as sort of an important emerging trend, is the rise of capacity building discourse in foreign policy and its significance for strategy. So yeah, I'll leave it there for now.
Appreciate it.
Trey, thank you for the introduction and thank you for the free promotion of the book. I really appreciate it. This wasn't coordinated. Laurie, thanks for re-inviting me. It's really nice to be back here in Tallinn. A special, I guess, time to be back. The first time for me to be in the Hilton. The first time for me to actually wear sun cream. I don't know if others had to use it as well in verging outside. And the first time speaking about compute rather than on military cyber conflict related issues. And if I may, for these opening remarks, immediately tie it a bit more to AI. And I will promise after that I will veer into different directions on which I have a bit more expertise. And as I veer and connect the compute topic more closely to AI, I thought to have a bit of interaction with the audience as well. Right? When we think about the AI triad, compute here is of course key, combined with your algorithms and data. And I thought, let's do a show of hands when we think historically across this AI triad of compute, algorithms, and data, which of the three you all here in this room think has been the most important. So let's start with a show of hands for compute. It's a very small group, right? Not very good at numbers, but it looks like 10%. Algorithms? So that's also a guesstimate, unless people are not participating. That's also small. And then so going to data, is that then the great majority? That's fascinating, right? Mm-hmm. That's I think a very interesting answer. And before delving into some research that has been published on this, let's do one more interaction. That's about the future. So when we think about the future in this AI triad, let's do it again. Who thinks that compute will play the biggest role? So that's a few more hands. And then let's move to algorithms. And then lastly, let's move to data, where we still now see, it seems a bit more of an even division that is out here. I think that's an interesting finding, not least because if you look at some of the research that is out here, and I think some of the best research has come from a rather small think tank that has emerged, Epoch AI. It's a small think tank that has, at least if Twitter has anything to say about, or now X, about the size of this organization, a couple of thousand followers only, but it's doing very well and doing particularly a lot of rigorous analysis. You know, the high-level statement is clearly compute and compute and algorithms have been driving the AI revolution for the past 1.5 decades, and it hasn't been data, right? So a bit counter to what has come up here in the room, and they focus then on a number of different elements in which they contextualize also the role of compute over the different periods. And if we then look in the pre-2010 age, the you can say deep learning age of AI, compute's role was primarily one, and its increase in AI and its ability to enhance AI was primarily just driven by Moore's law, right? And so we saw that compute just got better by the number of transistors that increased and doubled every 2 years. And so that was the sort of early rise, but it wasn't necessarily a major investment that was being done in AI that was driving these improvements. And then we saw a change in 2012 with a number of clear business breakthroughs that led to greater investments, which meant that just a greater number of companies were buying a lot more GPUs, combined then with the real deep learning revolution that was coming as well, that changed the algorithm space that we have today. And then in 2014, you see the scaling up, where you see, of course, Google with AlphaGo completely changing the landscape, where from 2014 onwards, the investments that big corporations are making into AI changes the landscape altogether in terms of the budgets that they have available for compute. It means that the individual academic is no longer able to compete with bigger businesses. They are able to certainly contribute on the algorithm side, but extremely hard to push out the best models that are out there today. And of course, we all then, as a result of it, know what the big corporations like OpenAI and others are doing right today. Now, when we then look at the data element in this whole equation, that I think is worth pointing out to, is that, early on, this was almost like a hobby project. There wasn't an extremely big investment into ensuring that there was the right amount of data that can be poured into. There was a feeling that there was enough quantity out there that could still complement sort of the quality of data. And this is something that we're slowly changing today. According to some estimates, Epoch AI argument is that in 10 years out, we run out of data to train our AI models. But more interestingly, with that, there are now, of course, questions on what type of proprietary data do you want to feed into your models. And as a result of that, we see now a couple of new and recent cases, such as, Google using Reddit for, buying their information, Amazon being quite creative, Microsoft, of course, too. So I guess interesting to see these dynamics and curious to see how they change, but I do think it's important to set that context also as we talk later about the role of compute in this broader debate.
Awesome.
Thanks. Yeah, jumping off of what Max was discussing there, something that I wanted to kind of quickly raise, and I will revisit through the course of this conversation, is really to look at, where does this generative capacity, these compute power, data, where does it live, where is it being processed? And really focusing on the fact that much of this activity is taking place in the private sector. So what we're discussing today is compute power as a competitive national resource. But I want to touch on the idea that both access to and the ability to process data is a key source of power within the cyber domain, and obviously emanating outwards as well, but one that states hold very little actual control over. This is something that we'll discuss further throughout, is sort of what is the role of states and supranational bodies in understanding this space, a space in which, again, they don't really live. They're not kind of living and breathing the actual generation of this data, the actual processing of this data. But nevertheless, it is very important, as we will discuss further, it's very important for the creation of a certain new type of national power and international power. So with that, I don't want to go on, and again, I will talk on this subject a little bit further as we move on.
Wow, this is kind of a hard group to follow. So I'll flash us back to 2021, 2022. Pretty sure none of us really want to go back to that time at this point, but just quickly entertain me. It became very clear that with the advent of the pandemic, in juxtaposition with global semiconductor shortage and the rise of generative AI and large language models, we kind of got this perfect storm about this point in time for the need for more computing power, additional semiconductor resources, particularly identifying a gap in resilience and redundancy of these resources. That's where you started seeing governments like the United States start to introduce the Chips and Science Act, the EU introducing the EU Chips Act. More recently, you started seeing governments like Japan start investing more heavily into semiconductor resourcing, all to try to address this issue of resilience. One thing I do want to try to draw a little bit more of a narrow focus on, though, is resilience of what part of the semiconductor value chain, right? Ultimately, there are several key components of that value chain to include the design of those chips, of which the supply chains of those chips include things like IP, they include your design software. Then you go into what most of the sort of government-driven initiatives have been thus far, being manufacturing, right? So I think of the $50+ billion that the U.S. allocated through the CHIPS and Science Act, roughly $40 billion of that was for manufacturing. And so that includes your equipment, that includes your actual fabrication, that includes the chemicals, that includes the manufacturing tools. There's a lot of different components that go into manufacturing, and that also depends on what sort of node you're looking to produce, right? Are you looking to produce an advanced node, your 7 nanometer, 5 nanometer below, or are you looking for larger nanometer chips, right? Depending on the actual gap you're looking to fill in capacity. And then finally, you look at your packaging, your advanced packaging, which includes your assembly of those dies, and those are located, all of those different aspects and all of those different value chains are located broadly across the globe, right? There are key nexus points, and I think that was what drove a lot of these as well, particularly around manufacturing of advanced nodes, but also packaging. I mean, packaging is primarily located in Asia. Southeast Asia and in China. So I think there's more recent initiatives in Costa Rica and other places. But I think ultimately governments were looking to try to help increase the resilience of semiconductor chips, and that includes strategic investment.
So this is interesting because I think it helps highlight what we're talking about and why we're here, right? We're not just talking about semiconductors and the supply chain, although there is this globally distributed supply chain for how these technologies come to be. Talking about how we're accessing and utilizing compute, right? We're working through the private sector. We have this kind of competitive aspect between the different aspects, especially in AI, of compute, data, and algorithms, right? The software, the actual raw material, and the hardware that's creating value out of this. But I think, Julia, your point really strikes me as we're coming back to this is the enabling aspects of how we utilize compute and get access to it are a lot about much more than just doing the computing. So I wonder if I could go to you and to Taylor on this for a second. So what is it that makes computing capacity a distinctively sort of important feature in this broader landscape of digital infrastructure? And as we're thinking about all these different enabling tentacles and relationships, what do we have to think about in computing that's unique? Or what is it sort of particularly challenging? Maybe start with you and then go to Taylor.
Sure. Thank you very much, Trey, and thank you again for the invitation to speak. I think, so I'd like to actually touch on a point that you raised about I think one of the most obvious areas of compute power is that it can enable many different technological capabilities. And that's been true in the last few decades. Compute power has really shaped our modern technology. I think this esteemed audience is aware of this. But it also has a foundational role in military advancements. We see this with older precision weapons and the development of that by the US, as well as remote sensing. It has relevance for intelligence gathering, and also a more advanced compute, such as artificial intelligence, can lead to further sort of cutting edge capabilities. And that's where the conversation around frontier AI and risks around artificial intelligence and military operations, so beyond automation, but having human in the loop or on the loop conversations come in. So in some ways, compute power has been with us for a very long time, and it's really shaped sort of these more quotidian developments in civilian and military contexts, but it also has the potential to really sort of skyrocket us into the future, and that's where sort of the future concerns around compute become relevant. So in some ways, though, the access to higher level compute is quite segregated. And that's where I think you start to see differences in how compute may enable some actors, but not others in kind of unequal ways. So I guess some of these risks around compute relate to arms racing dynamics at the higher level between great powers, but they also relate to a country's digital transformation. So I think the landscape around compute power is actually quite complex and diverse in terms of the scale that it can be used and accessed by different state actors, and I'm sure that's what Emma can touch upon in more detail.
Taylor, same question.
I mean, to drill in more on your point on innovation, right? The digital infrastructure right now, in order to, you really need to be able to increase the efficiency, the specialization, and the optimization in order to be able to sort of drive key technological innovation, right? And computing power provides all of those things. The more computing power you have, the more tasks you can complete, the quicker and simultaneously, right? That's the whole integral point of processing power. Now, with the advent of AI, you start seeing things like, well, we demand more efficient algorithms. We demand better memory management. We demand better parallelization, code optimization. All of these things are sort of what drive the need for increased computing capacity in order to be able to compete, frankly, in order to be able to innovate, and in order to be able to be at the cutting edge of technological development. And so that's clearly driving a lot of nation-state actors to continue to invest heavily into acquiring such resources.
I like this point, I think, as both of you guys are talking through this, compute's not a static construct. Right, it's been changing significantly through time. And I think, Max, you made this point earlier, right, as we see Moore's Law come to an end, we see the reaction of industry trying to figure out how to squeeze more performance out of chips that don't have the ability to continue to change transistor density in the same way. We see this increasing specialization. Taylor, to your point, the creation of a multitude of new kinds of chips and new kinds of computing. We get a really interesting sort of heterogeneous landscape of compute. So as we're walking into that landscape, we're starting to see this applied in different ways in conflict. Max and Emma, I want to come back to you guys. Where do we see computing being used in contemporary conflict, and what makes this different, if at all, from conflicts in past? Maybe Emma and then Max.
Sure, yeah, thank you. So we live and fight in an era of overwhelming data. What compute and the technologies that it enables promise is an increased and perhaps asymmetric ability to process that information and transform it into advantage. As Taylor mentioned, part of the drive here is, do it better, faster. All of these different inputs kind of driving towards that central purpose. Historically, though, we have seen this, quest for better, faster advantage of information over the course of history. Information and the ability to wield it better than the adversary has always been core to warfighting, whether that's the strategic employment of Enigma decoded information in World War II, or the near decisiveness of the informational and environmental advantage of the ambush of 3 Roman legions in the Teutoburg Forest in 9 AD. In contemporary conflict, as we see in Ukraine, the information environment, composed of cyber infrastructure, both digital and physical, and the data, networks, and ideas that flow through and across it, is more than a domain through which the combatants are engaging in, or a set of tools by which those combatants engage. It is a parallel territory in some senses that adversaries are intent on shaping themselves. I think a challenge here is that this is undebatably a new and developing area of technology. However, we need to strike a balance between avoiding constructs that are outdated, that will hold us back, tying us to past frames of thinking, particularly in the military frame, while also avoiding the impulse to say that this field is so new that we have no foundations to build upon. We do have history of employing things like, how do we use information better, faster, in a warfighting domain, but we need to strike that balance of understanding how we actually apply it to the current day.
Max?
So I think, Emma, you raised a number of really interesting doctrinal and conceptual questions all around, also around, compute and its role in multi-domain operations. You asked Trey about some concrete examples, and of course, you're teeing us up to talk about a bit more specific, about Ukraine here. It's, of course, the conflict on everyone's mind, unfortunately. If I may bring in the audience again, one last time, just to get a sense here of people in the room, who has heard of Delta? And I mean not the airline.
A couple of very firmly convinced hands.
Okay, good. There you go. I can imagine a couple of people here on my left have certainly heard about it and engaged with it. So a small number of people in the room. So I think it deserves a bit more context to explain here about what Delta is, right? It's a situational situational awareness platform that is developed by the Ukrainian military, now being managed and operated by the Ministry of Defense. And it does something that you will see in many NATO countries, right, as a situational awareness platform, focusing on feeding in real-time information that can be used at multiple levels of warfare. This real-time information is crucially important, particularly right now, in making quick decisions that enable action that we didn't see before. But there are a couple of interesting things I think worth highlighting here that tie some of the debates here together in this specific example. Clearly, a crucially important platform. The first one is, where are you going to put your servers? Right? At least based on public information available, the servers are based in Ukraine in this case, right? This is something that has not been pushed out yet outside of the country. And a real question here is like, should you keep doing that or should you not do this? And this goes back to your sort of opening remarks around, of course, the physicality that comes with compute and comes with these type of, these extremely valuable assets. The second is, I guess, the accessibility on who are you going to give the opportunity to feed in data and who do you give the opportunity to actually understand and use this platform. In this case, it seems to be both Ukrainian language as well as English language, which might give a sense of potentially other allies who are able to have access to this platform as well. But the third one, and I guess that comes closest to my of course, research focus, is the cybersecurity element, right? We see here a hugely powerful platform, but it is also one which is extremely dangerous once it is potentially insecure or once it is infiltrated. And unfortunately, in this case, we know of one publicly known incident that was luckily rather contained, of which the Ukrainian government did acknowledge that there was a short temporary access likely achieved through someone in the Carver region that allowed for, I believe, several minutes, maybe 10, access to the platform. Now, that access didn't likely lead to the loss of data that had long durability, but I do think it showcases the sort of real struggles that we're facing in these contexts as we're trying to really use compute to our advantage, but clearly opening the door for some very significant weaknesses as well, and the ability to play with that over time. And this is not a unique case, right? We've seen this in these massive platforms. We've seen this, again, in the Ukraine context, also in smaller cases, right? In 2015, 2016, I believe it was Reuters who first reported on the app that was developed by the Ukrainian military for artillery units to improve better targeting. We then see a very interesting CrowdStrike report that talks about the implant that was used by Fancy Bear, a Russian-operated group, to actually then gain access to that artillery app, giving a much better sense of where Ukrainian artillery units were. Again, it showcases the deep interconnection, and I'm pleased as a result of it to see here at CyCon that we are sort of putting these two together.
So I will say, for any PhD students in the room, there's clearly a great dissertation to be written about the history of computing as told through trying to put artillery shells on target more effectively, right? Because that is definitely a recurring trend here as we go from through history. I want to actually take a historical lens, though, on part of this, because I think the group brings up two really interesting themes as we think through how computing's changed. The first is this battle between monolithic computing systems and distributed computing. Right, as we look at history, say in the 60s and 70s, the battle was over sort of supercomputers, singular systems that had tremendous performance and capability. And Max, to your point now, we're talking through tremendously influential systems on the battlefield, built around cell phones, tablets, rack-mounted servers, but distributed computing infrastructure. The second theme that jumps out is the sort of closed versus open innovation cycle. Right? If it's the 1970s and I'm trying to come up with an exquisite computing system, I'm doing it deep in the bowels of a corporate research laboratory, or I'm doing it inside of a secret government facility. Now, as we think through, the power of a lot of these systems is their ability to use and leverage open source software, widely available commercial software, packaging both a mix of secret but accessible and widely open commercial technologies. So for Julia and for Max, maybe take us back for a minute. How is the competition around compute, the infrastructure and the actual activity of compute, different now versus in the Cold War era? What are we looking at as like a key differentiator in how we think about these problems now? Maybe we start with Julie and then come back to Max.
Sure, yeah, thank you. I'd say I touched on this a little bit in my previous remarks as regards to how compute has been initially integrated, and it was largely part of this, as you would describe, sort of a more centralized, closed, and more closely collaborated process with national security actors. And I think one of the most recent developments is obviously the rise of private actors, not only in working with governments, but actually in driving forward innovation, largely at a distance from governments. And some of that is seen through some of the market-driven logic, although this was also the case with semiconductor development during the Cold War, with Chris Miller's excellent book on the topic. He sort of traces the waxing and waning of these companies in working with government and sort of trying to resolve the tensions between strategic goals and market goals. And sometimes they overlapped and cohered with each other, and other times there were issues with market competition that then came into friction with national security objectives. So I think some of that we still see today. But I think what is interesting, at least in the British context with which I'm most familiar, is one of the key challenges facing government is how to work with AI companies and sort of bring them in into more of a national security context, and also in terms of addressing national security interests. And this makes me think of the open source, or it was the CTI panel yesterday with Neil Ashdown's paper about how do we actually work with private companies, do we bring them in voluntarily, in through which kind of forms. And I think some of this is also true with AI developments and working with AI companies. I think another recent development is where this talent is originating from and how expertise is transferring between the private sector and the public sector. So I also think that today, although I'm by no means an expert on the specific area, my observation is that expertise is really merging in the private sector and kind of concentrating there, or we see talent move from the public sector to the private sector. Although I'd be very curious to hear what the other panelists think on this. I'm not sure how that directly compares to historical cases, because there's obviously a flow between private sector and public sector in the Cold War as well. But I think this is also another key challenge, definitely in the UK context as well, is how do we maintain strong ties with the private sector as they develop cutting-edge technology? How do we keep them in the conversation?
That's helpful. Max?
Before I forget and answer your question, there's a really great
wait, we're not
report
doing
coming
that one,
out.
sorry.
Sorry?
There's a new book, sorry. I thought we were doing that
No.
again.
There is a great report coming out actually on Delta from Stefan Susanto at ETH that I would really recommend you to read. To your question on sort of the historical differences and what has remained the same, what has remained different. The way I thought about this previously was sort of around three big themes. So the big three are differences in complexity, applicability, and accessibility, right? So we see, as Taylor previously mentioned, way more complex supply chains that we saw, in the Cold War, that are way more global, across way more different types of input. Applicability has remarkably changed, right? We see a much wider set of applications from both government to the private sector, and Julia has touched upon this as well. And that makes integration of compute in these applications a lot more important too, whether this is the military that we already touched upon, or whether that includes the economic applications as well. And then the third one is just the accessibility to compute. Yes, when we think about the training of compute, we're now seeing this increasingly becoming into the hands, combined, with your AI models, into the hands of the larger organizations that also start to think increasingly about their own chip development. But when you generally think about the accessibility of compute, it's completely different than what it was in the Cold War. That changes, and it creates a number of different interesting implications. David van Weel yesterday talked about, the integrating this into the digital backbone, making that more important. Clearly, that fits in there. And, if we would not be maybe at this conference, but at a more societal-focused conference, we would talk about all the ethical questions that would come out of it, that clearly these three trends combined have now put to the forefront and make this a really complicated question. But despite these big differences, I wanted to make a plug for another research project from a PhD student, Tobias Pulver, and I really recommend it because he's doing such a fundamental research, looking at how the language has changed and not changed around what we saw in the Cold War, and particularly coming out of the US, and what we see today. And what you see is almost this dramatic notion where if you would substitute Japan for China, whether this is in the late 80s or early 90s, you could literally almost use those documents still today. And we tend to forget that, of course, when we now think about this Cold War competition, we focus on USSR and the US, but we tend to forget the language and the restrictions that were being imposed on China and discussions and fears that were there, and this sort of the debate that is almost, in some ways, reinvented, and the fear that is almost sort of reinvented, but also sort of cautiously ignored. And I thought it's worth pointing out here.
I love this point. So I love this point, in particular, I think, because of your triad, right? This idea of access to compute now, right? Export controls on the transfer of hardware or limits on the ability to access cloud services, principal focus for how we do this kind of constraint. In that period of time, though, in the 80s and the 90s, it's manufacturing. It's driven by who can build these kinds of chips. No, it's a really, really fantastic point in that space. You want to finish the thought? I don't want to. Okay, I don't want to cut you off.
I'm talking too much.
So as we get into this piece then, there's an open question about both how we conceptualize of compute, it as a resource, but also really fundamental questions about how states assimilate or harness this kind of power, as we talk about it having all these ramifications. So I want to get into that actual sort of mechanics of how we compete better around compute. And Taylor, I want to go to you for a second, because one of the big aspects of this that we run into is the relationship between computing and trust. Right? There's a strong kind of cybersecurity thread inside of here, but trust's sort of fuzzy construct. It's life, it's everything, it's everywhere. What does this? Break this down for us a little bit, because for you, I think in particular, we hear policymakers describe the interaction between technology providers and states using rhetoric like digital sovereignty, digital solidarity, and this recurring theme of trying to determine who is trustworthy. How do we think about this concept inside of this security-framed conversation about compute?
Sure. No, and if we were to weigh the benefits and demerits of the sovereignty versus the solidarity, we'd have an entire panel here to discuss that. So I won't necessarily couch it as such, but I do think that really you cannot assess trustworthiness of compute power, semiconductors, or whatever aspect of that value chain you want to assess without looking at either cybersecurity or supply chain security. It's an incomplete assessment of risk. You really need to be able to understand the importance of secure development, secure deployment, secure maintenance of the life cycle of that computing power, ultimately embedding and maintaining confidentiality and integrity of that core technology is going to be vital to building trust in the deployment of that advanced technology. So you can have controls on country of origin, you can have controls on data flow, but ultimately, at the end of the day, if it is insecure, it doesn't matter because the adversary has access to that system and that network. You really need to focus on, especially when you're looking at computing power, trust needs to be built in and demonstrated both upstream in supply chain controls, measures, as well as the utility of computing capability downstream and the security benefits that brings. So if you were looking upstream, right, there's a whole host of standards and practices that you can follow. NIST has 800-161. There's sets of ISO standards. There's CTPAT. But ultimately, you can also deploy policies and procedures that enable component-level traceability for selected systems. Ultimately, you can sign at the platform level that says that the integrity and the confidentiality of this chip from the time it was designed to the time it was shipped to you has remained as built, right? You're working with your device manufacturer or your equipment manufacturer to provide that sort of second level of traceability. that you really need to be able to say, I feel confident that what I am deploying here at the end state is indeed what I intended it to be. Because that gives you that level of assurance that, okay, at least I have that aspect of trust carved out, right? And as you mentioned earlier, there's a whole other sort of suite of issues that you sort of have to weigh when doing that risk calculation. But I think security is one that often is sort of, yes, of course we need security, but we're going to focus on these other things. So I think focusing in on security is incredibly important, as well as the transparency, right? So you've seen a lot more efforts around governments focusing on bill of materials, generally software bill of materials, although hardware bill of materials have been a priority for at least semiconductor manufacturers for a decade plus. And so taking those best practices, applying them so that we can provide that level of assurance to governments that indeed what they're being provided is secure, I think is very important.
Let me ask this to you, but I'd welcome anybody to chime in as we get into this. Do you feel like the discussion that's being had now is giving equal weight, both here and more broadly, is giving equal weight to restricting access to compute and associated technologies by foreign competitors versus figuring out how to better harness those capabilities by friendly states?
I wouldn't say it's necessarily equal weight. Look, governments are certainly not ignoring security and secure deployment of computing power, right? Like, there has been incredible attention to secure software development globally, right? You've seen, the SSDF and the Attestation Forum in the US. You've seen the Cyber Resilience Act in the EU, focusing on IoT and product security. But what hasn't been appropriately sort of inspected in my mind is the role of hardware security. Ultimately, at the end of the day, sort of we work across, and a lot of those in the computing industry work across transnational borders and have to comply with a variety of different pieces of legislation. But more than that, we're trying to drive sort of best practices. We're trying to drive better use cases, better foundational models so that we can actually raise the bar for the computing ecosystem. You start to see some exploratory research in like the NIST Cybersecurity Center of Excellence. There's a whole NIST IR series on 8320 that develop use cases and architectures to defend your government systems or critical infrastructure. These things focus around things like layered platform security, trusted computing platforms, and confidential computing for one. And actually to draw attention on that last piece, because that ties into some of our AI discussions, right? Confidential computing in the AI context sort of helps you encrypt your data in use. We focused a lot on data in transit, data in rest, but ultimately in the AI context, we really need to ensure that that data is secure while it is being used because of the edge implication concepts, because of the distribution of compute that we're starting to see. So if you're able to encrypt that data in use, you're able to activate hardware-based isolation and access control. You can actually do things like better federated learning or sort of attest to the trustworthiness of that computing by a third party. These are things that I think as we start exploring the future of where AI and security intersect, we need to start taking some of these security considerations better in mind from a policy perspective.
Can I quickly jump in here, Trey? Just to answer your question, and for a government to answer this question, or for the EU to answer this question, there is a preliminary question, which is literally the mapping of compute and the entire supply chain that is out there, right? And there is a clear acknowledgement there that the visibility of what is available and where it is coming from is insufficiently there right now, which makes it extremely hard to, of course, predictions more generally in this space are extremely hard, but it makes it extremely hard to predict with certain events happening, how does this will influence the supply chain, and also makes it extremely hard to know the choke points which you are actually dealing with. Now we see, with the EU Chips Act, that there is a greater emphasis on investing actually resources in the same way as the US is doing to actually better understand that entire ecosystem and its relevance to the EU. But we also see a rather decentralized setup still today to actually achieve that objective that is splintered across a number of different EU departments in a different way than you will see in the US, where you now have, and depending on the subject area, 30 to 60 people working on doing this better mapping. Here you get a bit more of a fragmented landscape of a couple of people at most in different departments that are trying to do this mapping. And I think one of the big changes that we'll have to see is a greater sort of centralized body that tries to bring that mapping capability together. Maybe a project for the Atlantic Council to help with as well as a think tank.
Let me push on this for a second and go to the group, right? Because I think so helpful to hear. It's not actually binary about how does somebody else use, how do we use. It's actually there's this sort of large, multifaceted relationship between the technology, providers of different components or infrastructure in that technology, and then both what we and competitors want to do with it. How should we, for everybody, how should we as a group be thinking through recognizing the significant role that the private sector plays, the importance of that relationship between public and private sector in this space particularly? Is it something where we need to take that and put it at the forefront? Can we have conversations about the relationship between computing and power, computing and international security without the private sector in the space at all? Is it we just need to evolve our models? We need to talk, how should we think about this? I'm curious for anybody's response to this.
I can jump in
Go for it.
first. I apologize in advance for using my own terminology in a field full of way too many terms. But I think an interesting way to look at this problem is sort of, we look at compute, there's a lot of different factors feeding in. So we can look at one hand as like functional compute. So the ability to actually, be the entity that has the data, can process it, and is actually kind of creating the technologies that we see coming out of it. We also, on the flip side, see something like compute output. So can you benefit from compute-enabled technologies? Are we seeing that? And I think an interesting question here is, if you look at it on the very kind of granular, who has functional compute power? Private sector companies. And obviously not every private sector company, but those specific private sector companies in this field. So I think it's a very interesting question when we talk about the translation of compute power to national power. To move through that, it's not just who is actually generating this, but how the output is sort of flowing through this space. And I think this kind of loops back to the earlier conversation as well, when we look at the generation of this power and the use of this power as well. It is a kind of open question on how we want to shape this across the different allied states. Taylor brought up a great point earlier of the importance of resiliency and redundancy. We also want to look at things like comparative advantage. Do we want all of our allied states to be each investing in, we want hardware manufacturing, and we also want the design, and we also, we want X part of this whole process. So I think that these concepts sort of interplay with this idea of how do we balance having sufficient resiliency and redundancy in this space when it comes to the actual kind of functional part of the compute, and then how do we make sure that the allied states are also having sufficient kind of the output part of that compute and direct it in a way that is actually beneficial to the whole international order, and not just the focus of compute power and its translation to kind of domestic economic power.
Others, Taylor and then Max?
You raise a really interesting point, particularly around scope, right? Like when we're talking about, I think you mentioned essential sort of firms, like those that are very vital and intrinsic to a nation state. Like, are we talking about what segment of that sort of overall value chain? So the ones I mentioned earlier, are you talking about design? Are you talking about manufacturing? Are you talking about assembly and test, right? Those all have a key role depending on where you are, right? And what nation state you're talking about. Another thing that hasn't really been brought up is the node of sophistication, right? What is the application of that computing power, right? Are you looking to deploy something that really requires that level of highly advanced, low nanometer sophistication, or do you really just need bulk, less sophisticated but high quantity computing power, right? And those are very different target audience. And one other point that your question raised, Trey, to me was, when I think, where does computing sit within critical infrastructure, right, as a category? Is it manufacturing? Because that's one sector, at least within the United States, on how they define critical infrastructure. That's one sector. Then there's IT sector, which certainly there's a lot of IT, depending on how you want to define it, as semiconductors. It also underpins the water sector, the healthcare sector, the energy sector. All of them, it's foundational to all of those. So when it comes to how governments interact with this sector, it's really difficult, because not only does it underpin others, but it also sort of straddles between other different sort of quote-unquote divided sectors. And so when it comes to working with the government, it becomes really difficult because we interact in so many different spaces.
So clearly, the private sector, when it comes to this issue, holds great power on both the supply side as well as on the demand side, right? And when we go back to the discussion around the Cold War, there are differences there, certainly on each of those. And that means that governments will have to think about shaping that and dealing with that to Emma's point as well. Now, with the EU Chips Act, we have a slightly better understanding of the priorities that we will find here in Europe on how to do this. And there are three key parts in which the EU seeks to do this that they lay out in Pillar 3, right? The first one is around export restrictions. And that goes to your point also on where do you lie the emphasis on accessibility versus investment. Now, the key problem that you're facing here with the private sector is that ultimately, when it comes to semiconductors, it's still just a small part of the product that you're selling, right? And creating these type of restrictions, you're restricting a much wider set and a much wider industry that is trying to sell its products at a given point in time. And it's one that inevitably will reach an enormous amount of pushback that makes it hard to then complete these products. And then to Taylor's point, we've seen this already, of course, in the automobile industry when stuff like this happens in 2021. The second key shaping element in relation to the private sector is then around export authorizations, right? And this is where you will have now a European Commission that thinks that it could potentially be the central purchasing body or have some greater capability to centralize what is being purchased and not, that allows it to create more leverage, both with other countries as well as with the private sector. But that requires a great degree of foresight combined with coordination and understanding of what countries and within these countries, businesses and much smaller processes actually want to have. And it's going to be interesting to see what this will be in practice, but it is certainly the second one. The third one is this concept of priority rated orders, right? And this is that semiconductors that industries that receive subsidies are obliged to accept and prioritize certain orders by the European Commission to ensure the security of a chip supply for critical sectors. Now, you can sort of see that might work when you feel you have an industry that is heavily subsidized and you can sort of hit two nails at the head at the same time or whatever. But the problem that you create there are just the complexity of the supply chain that you're facing, combined with the lead-up times of actually producing, right? 4 to 7 months. So what are you going to do? Are you really going to say in times of crises, prioritize this over that? And then, the hundreds of sub-processes that follow from this suddenly have to change with its suppliers? It's hard to imagine. And then just last to point out, you get this sort of not mentioned in the third pillar, but you see some national initiatives, and the SNV, Stiftung Neue Verantwortung, has written on this, is this concept of national reserves, which they are also highly critical of, where you see particularly Spain talking about the potential to create leverage both against other countries and think about critical times. Can we create a national reserve of critical chips, and we can use them in time of need? Now, first, that goes back to the foresight question. It requires a great deal of foresight. And second, it goes to a question around the investment required, and in simple terms, leaving these things on the shelf for a significant period of time, in a space that is changing so quickly, tends not to be the most logic and optimal approach.
That's all. Julie, you want to jump in on this?
Yeah, sure. Just briefly, I think another area that I think is sort of a natural kind of complement to this in terms of working with the private sector that has been less discussed is the role of sort of human capacity, so maybe more of the softer digital infrastructure that's underlying this. So there's a lot of work to be done around sharing expertise, and that also shapes sort of these dynamics of supply and demand. So an example of this is how capacity building shapes both sort of, or how it factors in rather into digital infrastructure investments And this is clearly seen in the EU's Global Gateway project. For instance, there's a digital pillar that incorporates both hard infrastructure investments in areas of, or developing areas requiring digital infrastructure, but also softer mechanisms such as governance, which, depending on your view, maybe that's perhaps not as soft, but more still a structural form of shaping. And the EU recently, as well as the US, while it doesn't have direct control or ownership over private firms in comparison to other more powerful actors, it has recently sought to incorporate the private sector in some of its larger scale investment initiatives that are directed from more of a sustainable development perspective. So it's another way of working with the private sector to shape the international environment around compute. And of course, another area where this intersects is the role of foreign tech transfers and the demand for foreign tech having a relationship to cloud computing. So often there's an interoperability issue where foreign tech, for instance, Alipay might be desired in a country, but it also offers services with the cloud. So integrating Alipay or including that into your national infrastructure might lead to also an integration of Alibaba Cloud. And there's lots of sort of intersections between different forms of compute and cloud computing, and also how that relates to undersea cable developments that we've seen with private companies being incentivized to build privately owned cables, also as a way to kind of increase their own access over data outside of sort of, you might say, the prying eyes of intelligence agencies. Some have argued, at least.
Huge amount of enabling infrastructure, even before we get to the buying of chips. I want to ask the group one or two more questions specifically on conflict, but then we're going to go to the room. So there's going to be some mics that circulate. But two things I think to call out from this frame. The first is this point I think Emma makes about complementary capabilities. So if we think about NATO as an example, we don't necessarily need every single state chasing the highest performance computing capacity, able to build, operate exactly the same kind of models. And I'm struck by this sounding very similar to some of the discussions in the 80s and 90s about multiplier assets. Not everybody needs an airborne radar. Not everybody needs to have, air tanking capacity. We need ways for the alliance to have capacity, but individual states may have complementary resources. So thinking about what that looks like in the compute situation, I think, is still to be defined. It would be interesting to really start to talk through, especially with folks in the room. But the other thing is this point about acquisition. So I love this idea of like stockpiling chips. It's really only one small sliver. It's not even the beginning of the process or the end of the process. It's one step in trying to harness value from compute. But I think Taylor and Max both make this point about the relationship with the private sector varies, even if we're just talking about chips, depending on what we're buying, right? If I need something that's going to drive small sensors, right, it's going to be able to parse incoming information from an IR sensor, that looks very different than if I'm trying to engineer an absolutely cutting-edge foundation model, right? It's a radically different kind of compute challenge. And you see that, especially in the US, right, some really interesting quotes, from some of our leadership on the Hill around the time of the pandemic era semiconductor shortage, where we're saying, look, we need chips that go into iPhones to go into cars. Like there's substitutability between these things. We know that's not true. So thinking about the relationship between public and private sector as part of that, and Max, to your point, high trust spaces pose a really unique challenge. There was an issue that popped up just a couple of weeks ago in the States where the CHIPS Act had actually had money allocated inside of it for funding a special sort of high trust chip manufacturing and packaging facility for the DoD. And it was subject to a lot of consternation because it was money that was being taken away from broad-based commercial manufacturing of semiconductors. And there was sort of this concern about the possibility that it might undermine that broader mission of driving competitive, healthy, broader base of supply for those kinds of chips. But as I said, before we come to the audience, I want to address one of the largest land wars we've had in Europe in history, and the role that computing plays in this space. So I want to lead this off with you. How does the war in Ukraine inform our understanding in acute, obviously incredibly painful, but very real ways of this competition for compute? What kinds of examples or maybe features of that conflict speak to this competition that we've been talking through today?
Yeah, so as I've said, the war in Ukraine has demonstrated the degree to which the private sector's role in defense within the cyber environment is perhaps existential. So I won't attempt to enumerate every example of tech assistance that we've seen in Ukraine, but I do want to talk about a few different examples of specifically compute-related technologies that we've seen. This is teed up very nicely by Max's earlier comment on, when we look in Ukraine, where are the servers? Where is the information? So obviously, just until right before the Russian invasion, Ukrainian data was held within the borders of Ukraine. It was a legal requirement that it had to be held within the borders of Ukraine. And very shortly before the invasion occurred, we saw the transfer of Ukrainian data to the cloud. We talk about the cloud. I think often in common parlance, we think of the cloud as like the place where the data is. But it's also important to think of it as the cloud is sort of the way to access compute power. So, not everybody, like we've kind of talked about, but on a smaller scale, not everybody needs these giant servers. The cloud enables you to access a piece of that. So we look at the case in Ukraine, the movement of key Ukrainian data to the cloud environment, both obviously guaranteed the consistency of that data. We saw very soon after the missiles targeting data centers in Ukraine. But this shift to cloud-based data storage was also a key enabler of DIA, enabling continuous government services. It enabled the Ukrainian government to continue to provide these services to its population with relatively little interruption. I think we've seen the importance, especially in light of kind of Russian efforts to undermine the Ukrainian government and its ability to lead its people. The continuance of those services is really essential in both a kind of tactical sense and also in a strategic sense. But also, I think often when we look at how does compute manifest, and specifically when we're looking at conflict, oftentimes we're thinking about is AI. So in the war in Ukraine, the AI's most widespread use was related to geospatial intelligence. So this is partially informed by the degree of available data. We obviously had a large amount of data coming in from low Earth orbit satellites, from social media, and partially from direct uploads from programs instituted by the Ukrainian government on DIA. And this geospatial intelligence was used partially to document Russian war crimes, to locate potentially mined areas, but also, as Max mentioned, platforms that could do things like assess battlefield damage, understand adversary troop movements, identify potential targets. So we've seen AI as a tool to basically get a better understanding of the space. And I think what's really important to talk about here is it's not just intelligence coming through, it's intelligence analysis as well being applied. We've seen AI being used in other ways. Don't want to go on for too long about this, but we have seen things like AI facial recognition being used to identify Russian war criminals, as well as use on both ends in the counter misinformation and misinformation on the Russian side's fight of Russian efforts to use AI to create disinformation efforts. And as well as Ukrainian counterintelligence efforts with the help of AI. So I think what we're seeing here is, we talked about kind of there's two sides of this. We have both the competition for compute and then also compute as used in conflict. I think what we're seeing here is a field in which many private companies are saying, we've been developing these capabilities and we are starting to see actual use cases here. This is not the only conflict in which we're seeing these actual use cases, but this is absolutely a field where we are sort of laying the groundwork now of that actual, more advanced technologies actually being used on the battlefield. And we have, I think, a lot to learn on that front.
Appreciate that. Yeah, just go back
I
out
was
to the
just going
group.
to quickly join in, because you mentioned the cloud example you mentioned is fascinating because a lot of concerns are raised when you're saying, we're transferring sensitive data to the cloud, but there's ways of doing that through the utility of hardware in a secure way, right? Like you're able to, the confidential computing capabilities I mentioned earlier, right? A broad set of capabilities that can ensure that, as that data is being utilized, it creates a containerized environment within that cloud infrastructure itself so that you're able to segment and isolate that data and ensure that others that are utilizing that cloud environment don't have access to that potentially sensitive citizen data as well. So like the hardware both enables the computing power as well as the security of that while that computation is transferring. So it's a great use case.
That's helpful. Any other thing, Kia, you want to call?
Yeah, the long answers from Emma and Taylor give me an opportunity to jot down a couple of remarks. The three are sort of high level and things that have already come up in other panels too. The first one, the ad hoc nature of the private sector support, including in potential cloud and other data transfer. The second on the private sector being in the lead, and in some ways government supporting, which has been different from other conflicts. And then at the same time, perhaps paradoxical, perhaps not, is then still the wariness of the private sector to potentially support, especially early on in the Ukraine conflict, and yet not being too involved all the time in actual things that are happening on the battlefield, right? And the fear that it then becomes also sort of too close to the military. Now, if these are sort of the high-level comments, I thought to point out to one thing, though, that I think is frequently missed in these discussions, and that's when we so often talk about the services from the private sector that have come into Ukraine, and much less about the services that have gone out of Russia. And I'm not talking here about Starbucks closing down or some other companies, but I'm talking here, for instance, about ESET, right? Here you have a threat intel capability that is highly active on a wide range of Russian boxes that gives a really good visibility of the cyber threat landscape that you have in Russia. Certainly not complete, but a pretty good sense. They're making decisions for a variety of different reasons, of course, to pull out of Russia, but it means that not just that company, but essentially the entire, you can say, Western world is losing a degree of visibility of actually what's going on in this country, and also better understanding some of those dynamics there as well. And I think it's worth pointing out, because I don't think in the short term for sure that visibility is something that we will ever get back. Now, again, this comes with limitations. It's not to say that everything in the past then was transparently published and that everyone had access to it, but there was a much greater awareness of what we were seeing there that simply doesn't exist today anymore, making it much harder to also understand some of the interactions that we're facing between Ukraine and Russia, or between the wider world and Russia, when it comes to all the cyber activity that I'm, of course, myself very interested in.
No, it's a fascinating point, and something we don't talk about as much is, right, that sort of denial of compute capability to the Russian state as part of this conflict. All right, I want to make sure we have time for questions from the audience. And so let me invite folks that are in the room. I've got a hand here up at the front, and I see one at the back as well, but we're going to wait for a microphone if you wouldn't mind, as the fine folks here have done a very good job to put all of this on video. So we have a question down here in the front to start. And if you could just introduce yourself and tell us where you're coming from.
Thank you. Looking forward, how could we restrict access to compute when there are huge global commercial drivers to embed it at the edge?
And where are you coming from, sir? Your organization. Your organization.
Sorry.
Who are you?
Oh, sorry. I'm Tim Parsons, Kinetic.
Person, thank you.
Shouldn't you start yourself? Yeah. Trey, you've written so much on cloud. You've published a couple of reports at the Atlantic Council. I don't want to push it directly to you, but I mean, you seem to be the most adequate here on
I'll
this
say
panel.
this, though. I think it is interesting that so much of the discussion has focused on restricting access to hardware, physical hardware, and far less so on access to services, given it's the bulk of the way people consume compute. One of the things I know that they're working through in the States right now is at the very end of the Trump administration, there was an executive order, it was actually, I think, one of the last, if not the last, signed, that created proposed a know your customer requirement for cloud services. And it sat mostly dormant through the first 3 years of the Biden administration, and it's now sort of been seized on as a way to address not just source of information about cybersecurity implications of who is using U.S. domiciled cloud services, signing up for and actually taking part in these services, but now who's potentially utilizing those services for building and training and deploying AI models. And so I think it'll be interesting to your question to see how much do the existing sort of choke points in the ecosystem where people access the services, actually access the compute, how much are those sustainable in the long term to try to restrict access to that? And I think that one of the challenges we're running into is because of the profusion of the space, there's so much stuff happening in generative AI. People are trying to get into this market. It may potentially start to pull on some of the influence of those core providers in ways that hasn't been anticipated. And requirements like this may add pressure to that. So there's a question sort of how hard and where do we squeeze the balloon as we go? But I'm curious others' thoughts on this. Yeah, maybe Max, to start with you.
Just recently, one news report that came out that really I found extremely striking, which was around ASML, and then TMSC came out as well, which talked about the kill switch, right? That in the case that we see a scenario where China would invade Taiwan, that there would be some type of kill switch available that would not allow the continuation of a variety of different supplies that have been supplied to China. And I thought it was striking, not least, to come out about this in public. Now, of course, there are a variety of different pressures that these organizations face today, but also because it sort of made me to think differently about a rather simplified view I had previously around this question of access and control, where I was looking much more at the services like the cloud that enable this opportunity to take away, yes, it gives you access, but you still have control, and to take it away at times when you want to, where you now see this being pushed also much more into the hardware space in ways that I simply didn't realize before.
Thoughts from anybody else before we jump on? Julie, go for it.
I mean, yeah, thank you. I'm not sure I can add much more substance, but I would say that the US's small yard, high fence approach is sort of a particular way or approach to restricting compute that obviously some of the logic behind that is to try to maintain foreign exports and consumer demand to a certain extent, yet restricting the highest level of compute. So I think some of the question is around which types of compute are sort of seeking to be restricted and how that relates to frontier AI training. So it's sort of a risk management orientation, as I understand that debate. There are other alternatives. As was mentioned, there's a sort of more of a baked-in hardware approach that I've read. There's a recent RAND report on this, which might provide more insights, but I know that's heavily debated as to the merits of doing that. There's also some serious downsides, but the report highlighted two areas. You can restrict you can create a licensing in which sort of seeks, so Max is nodding, so perhaps he can expand on this further, but as I understand it, you can restrict the degree to which the particular technology can compute. So you can put a higher threshold. You can set a threshold as to how smart or how much it can compute in terms of exaflops, I believe. And the second approach is more trying to restrict the extent to which you can use these single systems in clusters. So whether or not you can actually bring them together and get them to think more and at a higher level. So whether you can get them to engage in more deeper learning. And that was a very terrible, non-technical way of describing that. But essentially, instead of doing a sort of a restriction around which types of technology, so the small yard, high fence, you can also try to bake this in to the actual hardware of the export itself. But of course, there are downsides. And okay, great, Taylor can jump on this.
Yeah, I was also saying like that there are some downsides as well. You're mentioning this sort of kill switch. Ultimately, it's very difficult and not really feasible to do this from the chip manufacturing perspective because the required logic for changing that chip functionality actually resides off chip in the back-end architecture. So it's not necessarily like the chip manufacturers can just sort of determine what adversaries are using its computing power and flip something off necessarily. It's just an incredibly complicated issue for one single party to be able to manage. To highlight your point.
It's a good, and it maybe I think for folks that remember, right, it's a good callback to the encryption wars in the 1990s, right? The U.S. tried incredibly hard and relatively unsuccessfully to set specific limits, right, on key sizes and on encryption values as a way to try to constrain the spread of that capability, ultimately unsuccessful in limiting that. So where are we going to find sort of hard and fast golden numbers? Probably challenging in this space.
Just may I clarify one thing?
Yeah,
right?
sure.
We have two levels here, right? One is on restricting the actual machines to produce the chips and whether you can put a kill switch in this. In this case, the discussion on ASML is on ultraviolet machines, or whether this is about the chip level limits that you're setting that Julia was talking about. So these are sort of two different strains that we're discussing here.
Well clarified. Let's go back out to the room. Curious if there's hands. I see one right here.
Yeah, hi there. James Cummins. I work for Mandiant, part of Google Cloud, but previously I was serving military, working here within NATO as well. I want to say thanks for an excellent panel, and Max, I have just bought your book as well. But my question was on strategic advantage and what we think strategic advantage looks like, and specifically where we have this interplay between a nation state and private industry, and if the focal point is tending towards industry as having the building blocks of strategic advantage, whether that challenges whether a nation state can hold advantage or just procures it. And also what that means in terms of identity. For instance, private industry, what identity does that make within sort of international relations?
Good question. Maybe we get two folks from the panel. Hey, Julie, do you want to start?
Sure, thanks. I can take. Great question. I think what is meant by strategic advantage has been, it's very interesting to read recent strategic documents by the US and the UK specifically, in which they discuss building up technological capacity for strategic advantage. But what does that actually mean? And there is definitely some acknowledgement, particularly in the UK's recent Defence Command, its digital strategy, its integrated review refresh, which mentions the role of private sector and hyperscalers in building this defense digital backbone, but actually how they're incorporated into the national defense procurement process is kind of an open question. And as I understand that, it's quite challenging. So the short answer is there's a sense that certainly the private sector plays a core role in strategic advantage in the area of compute, but how states can maintain access and control over this infrastructure is one of the main challenges. I think another relevant component of this is actually at which point if you think about compute as a supply chain, or in the three stages that I mentioned in my opening remarks, so compute production, provision, and usage, at which point are states most advantageous? So where can they really exert the most influence or power? I think that is also a very interesting question. Based on my research, I think one of the core areas is actually in building digital infrastructure and setting the terms in different parts of the globe. And some of that relates to access, building resilience and creating redundancy in undersea cable networks, and ensuring that undersea cable access is secure and managed by allies and partners. So that's where some of the discussion around the Indo-Pacific sort of resilience partnerships that are coming out from the US between a variety of different allies. So I think given the relative inelasticity of the semiconductor supply chain, there's another area of intervention that is quite important, which is sort of in the compute provision area. And some of that is through these infrastructure projects, which are often paired with capacity building and shaping. So that includes sharing best practices, setting norms, which itself can feed into broader sort of governance discourses and development. So it's a way of shaping through infrastructure investment. But that's just one area or one stage, I think.
Curious, one more from the panel. Just to emphasize Julia's piece there, right? Not just how you are using, how your allies able to utilize, right? So it's really interesting questions on how you're enabling others that you work with to try to harness these capabilities as well. Does somebody else from the panel want to? Yeah.
No, I was just going to add one more piece of that. When you were mentioning the capacity building piece of standards development. I mean, ultimately, if you're looking to invest in digital infrastructure in a way that is secure, resilient, and transparent, you have to be able to have the international best practices and standards that then set that foundational bar. And there are a lot of competing interests that are presented in these international bodies, depending on the one you're deciding on. So active engagement in those organizations is critical.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Max, to round us out.
Yeah, I don't want to take too much time for questions, but just to jump in on two issues. The first one here, to the points, perhaps I also myself didn't sufficiently acknowledge the actually massive investments that we have seen from from both the US and Europe into subsidizing a whole range of private sector industries that are relevant in this space. And it's quite monumental, actually, what we've seen over the last 2 years, and that creates at least some leverage. I don't know if that means that they hold the power or not, but I think it's worth mentioning. And the second, as we're talking about capacity building, the thing that we haven't talked about, nor what you would find in the EU Chips Act in any detail, is actually workforce development. There is really no plan here around workforce development, whilst it is clear that we will see very significant shortages for the decade or decades to come, right? And we can have different estimates. Some have said that this is in the tens of thousands. It's certainly less than you would find maybe in the broader cybersecurity space, where some people argue that it's in the millions, whatever it might be. But it's a very significant number, and clearly here, the government will have to play a lead role. You're not going to see the private sector taking a lead on that broader education that brings people into these type of streams. It has to be resolved. There is no plan in place. Perhaps something, again, for the Atlantic Council to pick up as a report.
Maybe just two other quick answers to the gentleman's question. I think first is the factor of time. Right, we tend to think about procurement like we're buying an object, but one of the consistent themes you've heard up here is that it's a broad value chain to try to get value out of those kinds of resources, out of that sort of infrastructure. And so if I'm the government, how am I showing a company that I want a long-term relationship, that I can invest in understanding how to harness those capabilities? The other, I think, realistically, is comparative advantage. If I'm a government looking at this relationship with the private sector, where do I have inbuilt advantage in legal authorities or capacity for what they can do? Where do they potentially have an advantage over me? How do I create complementarity in that relationship as opposed to trying to think about it as a one-for-one exchange? Let's take one more question if we can from the room. Sitting right here, ma'am, you in the front. Mic to your right. Oh, there you go.
Hi, Berenike, former CTI at BAE Systems. Taylor, you already mentioned how, so compute is obviously composed of both soft and hardware elements. Securing the software supply chain, you already mentioned how approaches are manifold, like for example, SBOMs. Going back to the hardware component though, most of that technology, let's say chips, most of those are still important from English failing today, from Southeast Asia, from China. And we don't really have a grip over vulnerabilities that might be introduced during the manufacturing process. Like, for example, root kernel vulnerabilities, firmware vulnerabilities that might allow for long-term espionage in the longer term. So can you comment on some approaches to better hardware security to prevent this massive dependency leads to long-term strategic disadvantage?
Right. It's a great question. And in terms of sort of the globally distributed supply chain, right, depending on what part of the value chain you're looking at, design or manufacturing or packaging, all are located, broadly across the world, but there are maps that you can find. SIE does a good job of doing some mapping of where the different sort of kernels of those activity reside. In terms of hardware supply chain, I mentioned a little bit earlier, but Intel in particular has taken a pretty concerted effort to try to address some of that concern around integrity as throughout its entire value chain, right? Whether that be design all the way through manufacturing to packaging. In fact, we have that component level traceability that I was mentioning before, being able to digitally sign that at the platform level. Even when it leaves Intel, because I think that's where it leaves any other manufacturer, down to the ODM or ODM, you want to make sure that what you have is as built, right? You want to make sure at the end of the day that you're not looking at something that has been potentially subverted throughout that value chain. And there are controls, transparent supply chain capabilities, whether that Intel or broader. It needs to be better ingrained in international standards. Because while we can have rigorous policies and processes in place, we also have to maintain that our suppliers do so as well. And while we have an exhausted list of life cycle management that we try to maintain a rigorous oversight of our suppliers, without that sort of foundational international standard that we can then point to, it makes it more difficult. It makes a lot more work for us. So again, back to the international standards point, making that a priority for governments, I think it's going to be critical moving forward.
That's a good recurring theme. This is international, right? It's very
Yes.
little done in silos. Seeing as we're at time, I want to just extend from the Atlantic Council a big thank you to CCD, COE, and CyCon for partnering on putting this together. And if you wouldn't mind, join me in thanking our panelists for the discussion.